everyone. My name is Sabine El-Chidiac. I'm the Canadian Policy Associate at the Consumer Choice Centre. I'm talking today with Yaël Ossowski, the Deputy Director of the Consumer Choice Centre, and David Clement, the North American Affairs Manager at the Consumer Choice Centre. We're talking about a very relevant topic today, tariffs. It's all over the news. It's taking up a lot of the time of politicians and a lot of policymakers, and it's taking up our time, unfortunately, as well, because we're worried about the future of the economies of the United States and Canada when it comes to tariffs. And we already have an affordability crisis. We already have Canadians and Americans struggling to pay for essentials, to pay their bills, and now we have this threat of tariffs looming. And it's an age-old topic, unfortunately. It just keeps coming back to hurt consumers. And so we wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about what tariffs actually are and how they affect consumers. So really glad to be joined by these two people who have talked a lot about tariffs in the past and know a lot about it. Then they're joining me today to talk about that. So let's start off really basic and talk about what tariffs actually are. We often say that tariffs are just a fancier word for taxes, but what are tariffs exactly, and why do we say things like that about them?
I guess I'll start. So tariffs are duties that are imposed upon imports. Whenever you have a product that's arriving from a certain destination outside of your own borders, once that product lands in that country, there is a duty or tax that is applied, and that's called a tariff. And that has to be paid by the exporter from the other country or the importer in the new country. So it is a cost that is forwarded to the government, and that is put into the treasury. And for many, many years, this was sort of standard practice for trading between countries. If we go back to the founding of both the British Empire and the United States, essentially you had tariffs were the only way to fund the federal government, at least in the United States. So tariffs were normally very high, and tariffs, at least in policy, kind of serve the purpose of, number one, protecting domestic industry, and then number two, funding government. And what we've seen probably in the last 30 to 40 years is you've had a kind of much more retaliatory approach with tariffs. You've had sort of a battle between different jurisdictions, different products. There's a lot of protectionism and things that are either exempted from tariffs, depending on what they are, or even more tariffs are added on. So I think generally that is kind of what the tariffs are about. And the reason we say that they're mostly taxes on consumers is because that higher cost has to be borne somewhere. Sometimes if you order a product directly from someone else and you receive that, you will have to pay that tariff yourself, as has happened to me many times. When I'm in Europe and I order something from Canada, even though we have a free trade agreement that's kind of in the books, not yet 100% ratified and put into place, I have to pay an additional tax to the government for receiving something from Canada. So that's generally in a nutshell what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, the only thing I would add is an old Milton Friedman quote on what tariffs protect consumers from. So they protect domestic consumers very well against one thing, and that's lower prices, because tariffs make imports more expensive, and they constrict the supply of goods in the market. I mean, it's been shown time and time again that increases the cost of goods on two fronts, and this is really what most people forget when we talk about tariffs. So the tariff immediately increases the price of goods for the goods that are impacted by the tariff. But what it also does decreases supply, because it creates these vast price disparities. And when you decrease supply, or you limit the amount of competitors in a marketplace from the producer side, naturally you see prices increase as well, because you don't have competition putting that downward pressure on prices. And so not only does it directly increase the price of the goods that are targeted by the tariff, it also usually increases the prices for the alternative products, because they just don't have to compete anymore with the products that otherwise would have been imported.
So right now we're facing a tariff threat between the United States, Canada, and Mexico and China. But I wanted to focus a little bit more on the age-old allies, United States and Canada. Can you tell us a little bit about what that threat looks like and what you think might happen?
It should be noted that this would have a very devastating impact on the Canadian economy. And so the numbers that we have right now, all right, we're still 10 plus days away from seeing if this will actually happen. But if it were to happen, a 25% tariff would likely result in a 2.6% per year decline in Canadian real GDP. And that might sound obscure to some people. The 2.6% is like, okay, well, one, that's an instant recession. So instant recession. Two, the COVID-19 pandemic had a 1.3% impact on the Canadian economy. So we are talking a double pandemic per year impact on the Canadian economy. That is devastating. And it's devastating because for so long we have had such a great trading relationship with the United States, not just in completed goods, right? It's not like, oh, well, we send toasters to the U.S. and they send us clothing. And the supply chains for the North American market in something like the auto sector, you can have the pieces that go into making a vehicle cross the border 5 or 6 times before it becomes a completed product. So an example would be certain plastics that are involved in the creation of cars at the Ford plant in Oakville come across the border from U.S. plants, get put into the vehicle that's made in Oakville, and then 20% of the cars that are sold in the U.S. come from Canada. And so do you want to make those cars 25% more expensive for Americans? I don't know. I don't think that that's a particularly useful way forward for President Trump, given the fact that his mandate and the reason he won, despite his controversies, despite his personality, the reason he won was cost of living, right? He won on a pocketbook election, and the Democrats failed because they couldn't respond properly to that. And so he won on a pocketbook election saying, I'm going to make life more affordable, while at the same time advocating for policies that are going to make things more expensive. And there is one very useful historical example from the last Trump administration, and it's kind of funny because it's washing machines to wash your clothes. But President Trump created tariffs or added tariffs on imported washing machines. That caused a 12% increase in prices, which is about $88 per unit. So washing machines became $88 per unit more expensive, which I didn't know this until I started looking into it. Americans buy a lot of washing machines. So it created $1.56 billion in extra costs for consumers. Now, the president-elect and his supporters would say, that's okay. The inflated prices are okay because it's going to expand the domestic industry in the United States, and we're going to build things in the U.S. again. Okay, well, that policy created about 1,800 new jobs in the U.S. But when you do the math, 1.56 billion divided by 1,800 is a cost of $811,000 per job created. That is incredibly inefficient and incredibly wasteful. And by no stretch of the imagination does that pass a cost-benefit analysis. So you're basically just taxing consumers to subsidize inefficient jobs at rates that nobody would tolerate under any other circumstance, right? Imagine the government were to say, oh yeah, we're going to pay a company corporate welfare, right, to create jobs. And someone goes, yeah, but it's $811,000 per job created. They'd be like, that's a terrible deal. That's a
not
bad
a shovel-ready job.
Yeah, that's bad. Why would you do that? That's just a huge waste of of taxpayer money in the sense of corporate welfare. Now, this isn't corporate welfare. It's just American consumers subsidizing those jobs via tariffs. And that's just washing machines. So take that example multiplied by everything Canada exports to the United States, finished goods or not. And so it would almost be impossible to map that out in terms of what the actual final cost would be and how wasteful it would be, but it would be incredibly wasteful.
Yeah. And the numbers that David gives, I think, are really pertinent to this because it's like real cost, things that actually those numbers went up at the store when people went to buy things, or they added it to the cart online when they went to Best Buy or Target or whatever else. And I think one issue that I keep seeing pop up, because we've been talking about free trade and getting rid of tariffs at Consumer Choice Center for many years. And one thing I started noticing with many of the new Trump right is they say, well, tariffs are just a negotiating tactic, as if this is how it's always been, which is not true at all. And A. B, it's a terrible one because it leaves consumers worse off. And it's this kind of idea, well, he's not serious about, let's say, 25%. It's really only going to be 10 or 5, but it's so the other country can do. This is the kind of thing to where we kind of have embraced the Hollywoodness of what it means to be in government and what it means to practice public policy. And when things are gamified in this way, on paper, it looks interesting. But when you go to the checkout and you have to pay a lot more, it actually is a big deal. And, we've had many of the same free trade arguments between Canada and Europe, as I mentioned before, talking about dairy products or talking about what's the impact on farmers in this certain place, or is there going to be any chlorine chicken that makes our way into our economy? And I think we've allowed this idea of a tariff as a tool to kind of go too far, because there really are all of these impacts, which, and we have to realize that the system is meant to carve out many different things. There's something called the de minimis exemption, and that de minimis exemption applies to various containers that arrive from places like China to the United States, meaning if you had something that was worth under $800 in the container, technically it would not be subject to tariffs. Now, this was used as a loophole by many different companies that offer products that people like, things like Temu or Shine or any of these things. I don't know all the companies, but this was kind of used, this loophole, in order to get a lot of these products into the country. And it was actually great for consumers who really wanted to get it, who like it. If you don't like Amazon and you want to use your Temu, you're free to do so. And people are able to find cost savings or shop like a billionaire, as it said. But that's only because of like a loophole that people found. That basically has been closed up now by Joe Biden. This just happened in the last couple of weeks, but we're going to see much more of this. The thing is that markets have a way of finding products and getting them into the hands of consumers. There's going to be creative ways that hopefully we can come up with to get around this. Oftentimes, if we're talking about aluminum, steel, softwood, lumber, we can't necessarily do that because big products and things that have to go over a border and get checked. But overall, markets are trying to find the most efficient ways to provide products to people. And the more that politicians get involved, it becomes way more dysfunctional, way more expensive, and ultimately definitely not good for consumers.
Yeah, and one thing I would add here is that there can be a justification for tariffs. It does exist. But it's almost entirely geopolitical. And geopolitical in the context of your adversaries. So an example would be Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There is a legitimate argument that it is worth it to make Russian goods so expensive that North Americans do not buy them, so that you're not feeding Putin's war machine. There is a legitimate geopolitical view there that can be made, but that is not even remotely accurate for the relationship between Canada and the United States, or the United States and Europe, or the United States and Mexico. And so the the legitimacy of tariffs in niche instances does not mean that they're just this widespread legitimate tool that the federal government in the U.S. should use or threaten to use willy-nilly with their greatest trading partner.
Yeah. I love that point. You brought up the example, David, of the cars being made and put together in Ontario. And they're just kind of like back and forth. It goes over the border here for this part, over here for this part, and there's constantly sourcing back and forth across the border. And this is a thing that many of the trade restrictionists don't realize is that we don't just trade finished goods all over the world and that's it. Like whenever we are trying to build cars, we need aluminum and we need steel and we need, filaments and you need rare earth minerals and you need rubber and you need all this stuff. And we can't all grow that in our backyard.
There's always a retaliation when you look at history on tariffs. The retaliations are often pretty bad, but countries feel like they're put in a corner where they have to do this. I'd love to hear your thoughts, both of you, on retaliatory actions when it comes to tariffs.
So, the prevailing sentiment is that, well, something has to be done. But if you remember that tariffs are taxes paid for by domestic consumers, so what is the consequence? We're going to put a tariff on U.S. orange juice. Well, that just means that orange juice becomes whatever the tariff is, % more expensive for Canadian consumers. And that's especially true because we don't grow oranges. It's a little too cold for us to grow oranges. And so is it an appropriate, when you look at tariffs in that way, so Trump is making Canadian goods more expensive for Americans because he is upset about the border. Is an appropriate response to make American goods more expensive for Canadians in a cost of living crisis, as we've just gotten inflation down within the Bank of Canada's benchmark rate, completely undo all of the progress of unraveling the mess from the pandemic? Like, we were just getting there. We're just getting there at a time where record numbers of Canadians are lined up at food banks. Mortgage and housing costs are still high. There doesn't appear to be any movement on tax relief at the federal or provincial level, not in any meaningful or serious way. Carbon pricing is going to go up, and then the response is going to be to add to all of that pain by making American goods more expensive for Canadians to buy. Not great. Not great. And as much as it might be nice to wrap the flag around the idea and be patriotic about it and say, well, we need to do something, it's just a cost that Canadians are going to have to carry. And I just don't know, whatever the political appetite is for that right now, I think that will significantly wane as the consequences of that bear fruit, because Canadians will immediately see produce and everything, right? Everything that's imported from the U.S. go up, both finished goods and not.
Yeah, and we're talking about, at least between U.S. and Canada, like basically the largest bilateral trade relationship like on the planet. Like, this is like the two pieces of land that trade the most. Yeah, sometimes up to like $2 trillion of stuff going here, back. I think what has to be done in this circumstance, and David lays it out for the retaliatory tariffs and why that's such a bad idea, just talk about why the trade relationship is so important and what can be done. Trump is very big on the Keystone Pipeline, very big on pipelines in general. Well, what's the point of the Keystone Pipeline? It's to move Canadian oil through the United States and to be able to export it. So that is like a very important part of the Trump energy agenda, but the entire idea of Canada's oil sector, gas sector, is just kind of forgotten in that. And I think it made it very easy for him, especially when Trudeau was there, because he just wasn't someone who's very good on those issues, someone who basically nationalized a pipeline. But I think that's to where many of the political leaders in Canada, if they do want to stand up for their consumers, you have to go up and articulate why it is so important that we have this particular trade relationship. and why it is so important that we have various bridges that are, very integral to the Canadian economy and the American economy be open and free and not have to slap on money on what happens to be in your cargo box. There are smarter ways to do this. If we just start naming industries that we're going to put tariffs on either side of the border, it's just people who are going to end up paying more. And ordinary people who normally do not have the time or the energy to shop around, check out all the different deals, or know that they have a supplier in some other place where they can do it. People buy their stuff at the store or online. That's what they're dealt with. And for there to be other tariffs that will be implemented, and particularly boutique ones, imagine something on hockey sticks or pucks or, ice skates or heaters or, just something like that. I could see it kind of going down to this, because there are a lot of great Canadian industries that provide amazing products for Americans. And if we're just going to go in a tit for tat, we're just going to end up being poor. Ain't good.
So what are countries supposed to do when they're faced with a tariff threat, in your opinion?
Look for other markets and try and find open trade options elsewhere. One idea that I particularly love, which is something that which conservatives have supported, but they haven't been in government, so they have never been pressed on doing it. So something like CANZIC would be a nice pivot. It would be a free labor movement travel deal with Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. Now, I'm not saying that replaces the United States, because it doesn't. The trading relationship with the United States is significantly larger than whatever the opportunities with CANZIC are. But it would be a useful pivot. And this is what really kind of irritates me in the discussion, is that it's kind of universally understood in Ottawa that tariffs are a threat, that a problem, which means that free trade is good, right? Free trade is valuable and worth defending. So go defend it and go generate it and go make those deals and go look for new opportunities and open new markets and all of those things. Nobody seems to be pushing for that across the political spectrum. And if tariffs are bad and free trade is good, well, then maybe get your act together, then get moving.
Yep. And to David's point, you have to articulate the economic cooperation and why we all benefit. And the different industries in Canada that Americans rely on are important, and that should be articulated. Not just, hey, you'll have very nice wines, but, you have oil and gas, and you have different products from different provinces, you have wood. These things are integral to your own industries, to your own jobs. And we didn't even really talk about workers in this conversation, because it's not our focus as a consumer group, but that's also very important, is that if you allow free trade and reducing tariffs, it allows more people to work on things in their own industries. They don't have to work for the government, sort of being bean counters. They can actually produce good things that people like. So yeah, if you are a leader, it's easy to fall into the trap of saying, well, we're just going to, put on whatever tariff on Starbucks or whatever product that you guys like. You should be articulating the case of why this would harm consumers overall. Go there with a huge chart on the border. Just show the difference in price. And make those other deals like David mentioned too.
Political situation right now in Canada and the United States. In Canada, we have our parliaments prorogued. Our prime minister just left his job as leader of the Liberal Party. They're going to be selecting another leader, so his time is up. So we're in this transition period right now between now and March while the government is prorogued. And then on the American side, we have an inauguration that's happening in just a few days. So there is a transition period there as well. So all of this issue about tariffs is happening during a very interesting, let's just say, time for both countries. And that makes me feel uncomfortable, to say the least, that this is all playing out at a time of great transition for both countries. Where do you see this playing into the whole situation?
Yeah, well, it definitely will likely take whatever was left of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's reputation and rip it into shreds, or send it up the smokestack, because this is a perilous situation. Particularly, I mentioned it before, just Trump's musings about Governor of Canada and 51st state. This stuff is, for an American audience, it's just catnip. They love it. It's why people like Trump, is because he post memes about this, and he's openly talking about it. And he's like, well, we subsidize them so much. And, for ordinary Canadian people who have to think about their own sovereignty and their own economy and the way that they've run, their own independent country for many years, it's totally debilitating. And I think that's where you've had a huge loss. I think there's a lot of institutional things that are keeping it so that there won't be effective governance again. And, we can debate that and what could be done. But Trudeau definitely should have just left and called elections, because right now it's very weird. And I think one thing I always appreciate about the Canadian system is that it is very decentralized, and that the premiers do have a lot of power. And this is an opportunity for those premiers to stand up. And I think they've been doing that really well. I think Danielle Smith's efforts to go to the inauguration and talk to Trump more directly, and she's representing a very rich province with tons of interest in getting the product to the United States. So I think that could be very good. But for Trump is going to have a lot of agendas that he's going to be pushing in the first couple of days, a very willing Congress. So they'll probably give him a lot more leeway than they normally would. Hence, I think for us, at least as consumer advocates, it'll be important to continue to iterate the principle on this, and to continue to push back, and to ensure the president and his team that there are very important things to be doing in the first month. Let's just not impose new costs. Let's just cut costs, make things affordable. Don't do the tariff thing.
I mean, every day that tariffs are a thing, is just another day of just really economic devastation, especially for the most vulnerable in society, both in Canada and the United States. So every day that tariffs are there is just too many days. So thank you so much for speaking with me today about this, and taking the time to talk about tariffs. It's a really important topic, and we have a few more days till inauguration, so we'll see what happens. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Sabine.